Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English in Fluency. I am so glad you are here today because we are going to talk about something that really confuses a lot of English learners when they are trying to listen and understand real conversations. Have you ever been in a situation where you are talking to someone or maybe watching a movie in English and suddenly the people in the conversation start talking about something they already mentioned earlier and you have no idea how they got back to that topic? Like you thought they moved on completely, and then, boom, they are right back where they started, and you feel lost. Yeah, I know that feeling, and it is completely normal. Today, we are going to practice exactly that skill. We are going to learn how to follow conversations that recycle topics, that circle back to old ideas. And I promise you, by the end of this practice session, you are going to feel so much more confident when this happens in real life. So grab a cup of tea or coffee or whatever you like, sit back, relax, and let us get into it. Okay, so before we jump into the practice dialogues, I want to explain something really quickly, because understanding why this happens will actually help you follow it better. You see, in real English conversations, people do not talk in a straight line. They do not go from point A to point B to point C in a nice, neat order. No way. Real conversations are messy. They jump around. Someone mentions something. Then they get distracted by another idea. Then someone tells a quick story. And then somehow they end up right back at that first idea again. This is called topic recycling, and native speakers do it all the time without even thinking about it. It is actually one of the things that makes English sound natural and human. If everyone talked in a perfect straight line, it would sound like a robot reading a script, and nobody wants that. So when you notice a conversation going back to something that was said 10 minutes ago, do not panic. Your brain is not broken. You did not miss anything. This is just how real people talk. Now I am going to play out several conversations for you. Each one will have moments where the speakers go back to an earlier topic. I will be all the voices, so do not worry about trying to figure out who is who. Just focus on the meaning. After each conversation, I will explain what happened, where the recycling occurred, and why it sounds natural. Then I will ask you some questions to test your understanding. You can pause if you want to think about your answers, or you can just keep going and answer in your head. Either way works fine. Ready? Let us start with our first one. So in this first conversation, we have two friends named Jamie and Dana. They are sitting in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning catching up, because they have not seen each other in a few weeks. Listen carefully and notice how the topic moves around. Dana says, "Oh my God, I have been so stressed this week, I cannot even tell you." Jamie says, "Really, what happened?" Dana says, "Well, you know that project I told you about at work, the one with the new client." Jamie says, "Yeah, the restaurant one, right?" Dana says, "Exactly that one. So my boss added like 3 more meetings to the schedule. And every single meeting, the client changes their mind about what they want. It is driving me crazy." Jamie says, "That sounds awful. I hate when clients do that." Dana says, "Me too." "Oh, by the way, this coffee is really good. What did you get?" Jamie says, "I got the vanilla latte with oat milk." "Have you tried oat milk here?" Dana says, "No, I always get regular milk. I am kind of scared to try something new." Jamie says, "You should try it next time, it is so smooth." Dana says, "Maybe I will." Anyway, so back to the project. I was saying my coworker Priya actually helped me a lot. She stayed late with me on Wednesday, and we fixed the whole menu design. Jamie says, "Oh, that was nice of her." Dana says, "Yeah, Priya is great. We should all go out sometime. You, me, and Priya." Jamie says, "I would love that. It has been way too long since we did something fun together." Dana says, "Totally." "Oh, speaking of fun, remember that hiking trail you mentioned last month?" Jamie says, "Oh yeah, the one near the lake." Dana says, "Yeah, that one. Do you still want to go?" Jamie says, "I do, but maybe not this weekend because of the weather." Dana says, "True, it is supposed to rain. Let us plan it for next month instead." Jamie says, "Sounds good. But hey, I wanted to ask you about the restaurant project again. Did your boss say anything about the deadline?" Dana says, "Oh, right. Yes. So the deadline got pushed back a week, which is a huge relief, honestly." Jamie says, "Thank goodness for small miracles." Right? Okay. So let us break this down together. Did you notice how the conversation kept moving around? They started talking about Dana's stressful project at work. Then they shifted to talking about coffee and oat milk for a moment. Then Dana brought it back to the project when she said anyway, so back to the project. Then they moved to making plans to go out with Priya. Then Dana brought up a hiking trail that Jamie had mentioned a whole month ago. Then they went back to the weather, and then Jamie brought the conversation right back to the restaurant project again. So the project topic got recycled twice in this short conversation. The hiking trail topic came out of nowhere from a previous conversation they had a month ago. This is so common in real friendships. People store information from old conversations and bring it up later when it feels relevant. Let me ask you a few questions to check your understanding. What project was Dana stressed about? I hope you said it was a project for a new restaurant client. What drink did Jamie recommend to Dana? That is right. It was a vanilla latte with oat milk. Who helped Dana with the project? Yes, it was her co-worker Priya. What old topic did Dana bring up from a previous conversation? If you said the hiking trail near the lake, you are absolutely right. See, you followed that recycling perfectly. The key signal that Dana was bringing up an old topic was when she said, "Remember that hiking trail you mentioned last month?" That word "remember" is a huge clue that someone is recycling a topic. When you hear that word, your brain should instantly think, "Okay, we are going back to something from before, pay attention." Let us move on to our next conversation. This one is a bit longer, and the topic recycling is a little more subtle, so you really need to pay attention. In this one, we have three people. Marcus is planning a birthday party for his friend, and he is talking to his sister Tanya and his roommate Kevin about it. Marcus says, "Okay, I need your help with something." Tanya says, "What is going on?" Marcus says, "You know, Leo's birthday is coming up in 2 weeks, right?" Tanya says, "Oh my God, I completely forgot." "What are you thinking?" Marcus says, "I want to do something special this year. Not just dinner and drinks, like we always do." Kevin says, "Like what?" Marcus says, "I was thinking maybe a surprise party at our place. We could invite all his friends from college and from work." Tanya says, "That sounds amazing, but our apartment is kind of small for a big party." Marcus says, "I know that is the problem." Kevin says, "What about that rooftop bar downtown?" Marcus says, "Oh, the one on 5th Street." Kevin says, "Yeah, they have a private room you can rent. It is not too expensive, and there is a nice view." Marcus says, "That is actually a really good idea. I will look into that." Tanya says, "Leo would love that he is always talking about how he wants to go there." Marcus says, "Perfect. Oh, hey, before I forget, did you pick up those boxes? from the post office, Kevin?" Kevin says, "Oh no, I completely forgot. I will go tomorrow morning." Marcus says, "Please do, because my stuff has been sitting there for 3 days." Tanya says, "You are so disorganized." Marcus, "I swear." Marcus says, I know. Anyway, so, about the party, I need to make a guest list. Kevin says, "How many people are you thinking?" Marcus says, "Maybe 30 or 40. Tanya says, "That is a lot. Are you sure the rooftop place can fit that many?" Marcus says, "I am not sure yet. I need to call them." Kevin says you should also think about food. Leo is picky about food, remember. Marcus says, "Oh, right, I almost forgot about that. He does not eat seafood, and he is allergic to nuts." Tanya says, "And he does not like spicy food either." Marcus says, "This is getting complicated." Kevin says, "Not really. You just need to tell the restaurant about his allergies, and they can work around it." Marcus says, "True." "Oh, wait, Tanya, you were saying something earlier about our apartment being small. Do you think we should have a pre-party at our place first and then move to the rooftop?" Tanya says, that could work, actually. Like a small gathering before the surprise." Marcus says, "Yeah, like just close friends at our place for an hour, and then we all walk over together." Kevin says, "But if the apartment is too small for the main party, is it big enough for even a small pre-party?" Tanya says, "Good point. Maybe we should just skip the pre-party idea and do everything at the rooftop." Marcus says, "You are probably right. Let me call them tomorrow and ask about space and food options." Kevin says, "Sounds like a plan." And Marcus, please remember to call them tomorrow because you always forget things. Marcus says, "Hey, I do not always forget things." Tanya and Kevin both laugh and say, "Yes, you do." All right, let us talk about what happened here, because this conversation had several layers of topic recycling. First, they started talking about Leo's birthday party. Then Marcus suddenly brought up boxes from the post office, which had nothing to do with the party. Then Tanya commented on Marcus being disorganized, and right after that, Marcus said, "Anyway, so about the party," and pulled the conversation back to the main topic. Later in the conversation, Kevin mentioned that Leo is picky about food, and Marcus said, "Oh, right, I almost forgot about that." That was another recycling moment because the idea of Leo's food preferences was a detail from an earlier part of the same conversation. Then, at the end, Marcus brought back something Tanya had said much earlier about the apartment being small and used it to create a new idea about a pre-party. So the apartment size topic got recycled from earlier in the conversation and turned into a new discussion point. And finally, at the very end, Kevin circled back to the idea of Marcus being forgetful, which connected all the way back to the post office comment. It is like a big circle. Everything connects. Let me ask you some questions now. Whose birthday are they planning a party for? Yes, it is Leo's birthday. What was the first venue idea Marcus suggested? That is right, it was their own apartment. What venue did Kevin suggest instead? If you said the rooftop bar on 5th Street, you got it. What did Marcus ask Kevin about that had nothing to do with the party? It was the boxes from the post office. What food restrictions does Leo have? Let me see. He does not eat seafood, he is allergic to nuts, and he does not like spicy food. That is 3 restrictions. What old topic did Marcus bring back near the end of the conversation? He brought back Tanya's comment about the apartment being small and turned it into the pre-party idea. You see how that worked. The conversation kept circling and weaving and coming back to things, and the signals were phrases like, "Anyway, so, about the party," and "Oh, right." I almost forgot about that. These phrases are your best friends when you are listening to English because they tell you, hey, we are going back to something, pay attention. Now, let us do another conversation, and this one is going to be a little different. In this one, we have a mother and son. The mother's name is Helen, and the son's name is Ryan. Ryan is in his 20s, and he recently moved to a new city for a job. They are talking on the phone. Helen says, "Ryan, hi, sweetheart. How are you doing?" Ryan says, "Hi, Mom. I am good. Just busy with work. How are you?" Helen says, "I am fine. Your father and I went to that new Italian place last night." Ryan says, "Oh, yeah, how was it?" Helen says, "It was really nice, actually. The pasta was fresh, and the service was great. We sat outside because the weather was so lovely." Ryan says, "That sounds nice. I miss Italian food, honestly. There are so many restaurants here, but none of them are very good." Helen says you should try cooking at home. You used to make that pasta dish, remember? Ryan says, "Oh my God, Mom, that was years ago. I barely remember how to make it." Helen says it was simple. Garlic, olive oil, tomatoes, basil. You just need to practice. Ryan says, "Maybe." So work is going well, though. My boss gave me a new assignment. Helen says, "Oh, that is wonderful." What kind of assignment? Ryan says it is a marketing campaign for a fitness brand. I have to write all the social media posts and create a content calendar. Helen says that sounds like a lot of work. Ryan says it is, but I am learning a lot. Oh, and I have a meeting tomorrow with the client. I am a little nervous. Helen says you will be fine. You are very good at talking to people. Just be yourself. Ryan says, "Thanks, Mom. Oh, by the way, I went to the grocery store near my apartment, and they had really good tomatoes." Helen says, "See, that is a start. You could make the pasta." Ryan says, "Mom, please." Helen says, "Okay, okay, I will stop." So, when is your meeting tomorrow? Ryan says, "It is at 2 in the afternoon." Helen says, "Make sure you eat a good lunch before. You always get cranky when you are hungry." Ryan says, "I do not get cranky." Helen says, "Ryan, you absolutely get cranky. Ask anyone." Ryan says, "Fine, whatever." But hey, going back to what you said about the Italian place, did they have tiramisu? Helen says they did, and it was delicious. Why? Ryan says, "Because tiramisu is my favorite, and I have been craving it." Helen says, "Well, when you come visit next month, I will make it for you." Ryan says you make tiramisu now. Since when? Helen says I learned last month from a video online. Your father loved it. Ryan says, "Okay, now I am definitely visiting sooner." Helen says, "Good. Now, about that grocery store near you, do they have fresh basil?" Ryan says, "Mom." Helen says, "What?" Ryan says, "You are not letting this go? Are you?" Helen says, "Never." Okay, I love this conversation because it shows how family members recycle topics in such a natural and sometimes funny way. Let me break it down for you. They started by talking about an Italian restaurant. Then Helen mentioned Ryan's old pasta dish. Then the conversation shifted to Ryan's new work assignment. Then Ryan mentioned going to the grocery store and buying tomatoes. Then Helen immediately connected the tomatoes back to the pasta dish she had mentioned earlier. She just could not let it go. Then they talked about Ryan's meeting and his crankiness. Then Ryan himself brought the conversation back to the Italian restaurant from the very beginning when he asked about tiramisu. Then Helen connected the tiramisu to Ryan's upcoming visit. And then, at the very end, Helen brought back the grocery store topic and asked about basil, which again connected to the pasta recipe. so the pasta topic kept coming back like a boomerang. Helen mentioned it once, then Ryan's tomato comment triggered it again. Then, at the end, Helen brought it back one more time. And Ryan's question about tiramisu brought the whole conversation full circle back to the Italian restaurant from the start. This is so real. This is exactly how families talk. Someone plants a seed about something, and it keeps popping up throughout the conversation. Now, let me test you. What restaurant did Helen and Ryan's father go to? It was a new Italian place. What dish did Helen want Ryan to cook? It was a simple pasta with garlic, olive oil, tomatoes, and basil. What is Ryan's new work assignment about? It is a marketing campaign for a fitness brand. What time is Ryan's meeting? It is at 2 in the afternoon. What dessert did Ryan ask about? He asked about tiramisu. What did Helen ask about at the very end of the conversation? She asked if the grocery store near Ryan has fresh basil, which of course was connected to the pasta recipe she kept bringing up. Did you notice how Helen used the word see when Ryan mentioned the tomatoes? She said, "See, that is a start you could make the pasta." That word see is a recycling signal. It means I am connecting what you just said to something we talked about before. When you hear someone say see or see, there, or exactly like we were saying, it means they are linking the current moment to an earlier topic. I am so glad you are still with me, because we are going to go even deeper into topic recycling, and I have some really interesting conversations lined up for you. I want to start by talking about something I call invisible recycling. In the conversations we just did, all the recycling was pretty obvious. Someone would say, "Remember," or "speaking of," or "going back to what you said," and it was clear that they were bringing up an old topic. But in real life, a lot of topic recycling is invisible. There are no signal words. There are no obvious clues. Someone just suddenly starts talking about something from earlier, and you have to figure out on your own that they are recycling. This is the hardest type of recycling to follow, and it is the one that confuses learners the most. So, let me give you an example of what I mean. Imagine two friends are talking. One friend says, "I need to buy a new phone because mine keeps freezing." The other friend says, "Yeah, technology breaks so fast these days." Then they talk about something completely different for 5 minutes, like their weekend plans and a movie they watched. Then, out of nowhere, the first friend says, "I was looking at prices online, and the newest model is way too expensive." Now, there is no signal word here. The friend did not say going back to the phone, or remember I was saying. They just jumped right back into the phone topic, as if there had been no gap at all. This is invisible recycling, and it happens all the time, especially between close friends and family members who share a lot of context. The reason it works is that the human brain is actually really good at holding on to background information. Even when two people seem to have moved on to a completely different topic, the old topic is still floating somewhere in the back of their minds, and it can surface at any moment. So when you are listening to English, you need to keep a mental map of all the topics that have been mentioned, even the small ones, because any one of them can come back without warning. That sounds hard, right? But do not worry. The more you practice, the more automatic it becomes. And that is exactly what we are going to do right now. Here is our next conversation, and I want you to listen very carefully, because this one has a lot of invisible recycling. The characters are two college students named Danielle and Trevor. They are sitting in the campus library studying, but they keep getting distracted and talking. Danielle says, "I cannot focus at all today. My brain is just not working." Trevor says, "Same. I have been staring at this page for like 20 minutes, and I have read the same paragraph 5 times." Danielle says, "Maybe we need a break." Trevor says, "We have been taking breaks all afternoon." Danielle says, "True, but this is different. This is a mental break. Like we close our books and actually rest our brains for 10 minutes. Trevor says, "Okay, fine. So, what do you want to talk about?" Danielle says, "I do not know." "Anything. How was your weekend?" Trevor says it was good. "I went to my cousin's house on Saturday." Danielle says, "Oh yeah, which cousin?" Trevor says, "Sean, the one who just had a baby." Danielle says, "That is right. I forgot about that. Did you see the baby?" Trevor says, "Yeah, she is so tiny. Like impossibly tiny. I was scared to hold her." Danielle says, "That is sweet. Boys are always scared of babies." Trevor says, "I am not scared. I was just being careful." Danielle says, "Sure, Trevor, sure. So, what is the baby's name?" Trevor says, "Lily." Danielle says, "That is a pretty name." Trevor says, "Yeah, my aunt picked it. She has been wanting to name a baby Lily for years, apparently." Danielle says, "That is funny. Oh, hey, do you think we should order food? I am getting hungry." Trevor says it is only 4 o'clock. Danielle says, "I know, but I skipped lunch." Trevor says, "Why did you skip lunch?" Danielle says, "Because I was rushing to finish my essay, and I forgot to eat." Trevor says, "Danielle, you cannot skip meals. That is why you cannot focus right now. Your brain needs food." Danielle says, I know. Maybe we can get something from the cafeteria." Trevor says the cafeteria closes at 5. Danielle says, "Then we have time." "Oh, wait, I just remembered something. Your cousin Sean. Did he not also get a new job recently?" Trevor says, "Yeah, he did. He started at that tech company downtown." Danielle says, "That is great. So he had a baby and a new job at the same time. That is a lot." Trevor says he is exhausted but happy. Danielle says, "I bet. I can barely handle college, and I do not have a baby or a full-time job." Trevor says, "None of us can handle college. That is the universal experience." Danielle says, "True. Anyway, food. Cafeteria. Let us go." Trevor says, "Give me 5 more minutes." Danielle says, "You said that 15 minutes ago." Trevor says, "I know, but I really need to finish this chapter." Danielle says, "Fine. But I am going to look at the menu on my phone so we know what we want when we go." Trevor says, "Okay. Oh, and the baby's full name is Lily Rose." Danielle says, "That is even prettier." Trevor says, "Yeah." Danielle says, "Wait. I thought you said you were going to focus on your chapter." Trevor says, "I am focusing. This is multitasking." Danielle smiles and says, "Sure it is." Okay, so let us look at all the invisible recycling in this conversation. Danielle and Trevor started by talking about not being able to focus. Then they took a mental break, and Danielle asked about Trevor's weekend. Then they talked about his cousin Sean and the new baby Lily. Then Danielle suddenly brought up food, saying she was getting hungry. They discussed her skipping lunch and the cafeteria. Then, out of nowhere, Danielle said, "Oh, wait, I just remembered something your cousin Sean," and brought the baby topic back. She recycled it completely without a signal word. She just jumped back. Then they talked about Sean's new job and how busy he is. Then Danielle connected it back to college stress. Then they went back to the food topic. Then Trevor added the detail about the baby's full name being Lily Rose, which was another invisible recycling of the baby topic. And then Danielle called him out for not focusing, which actually recycled the very first topic of the conversation about not being able to focus. So the topics that kept coming back were the baby food and the inability to focus. And almost none of the recycling had obvious signal words. Danielle just jumped back to Sean by saying, "I just remembered something," which is a very light signal. And Trevor just dropped the baby's full name into the conversation, as if they had never stopped talking about it. This is what invisible recycling looks like, and it is everywhere once you start noticing it. Let me ask you some questions. What were Danielle and Trevor supposed to be doing? They were supposed to be studying in the library. What is the name of Trevor's cousin? His name is Sean. What is the baby's full name? It is Lily Rose. Where does Sean work? He works at a tech company downtown. Why did Danielle skip lunch? She was rushing to finish an essay and forgot to eat. What was the very last topic Danielle brought back at the end of the conversation? She brought back the topic of not being able to focus, which was the very first thing they talked about. That full circle moment is so natural and so human. If you caught that, you are really developing a sharp ear for recycling. Let us do another one. This conversation is between two people who are on a first date. Their names are Eric and Naomi. First date conversations are really interesting for topic recycling because people are nervous and they often bring things up multiple times, trying to keep the conversation flowing. Listen to how this plays out. Eric says, "So you said you work in marketing, right?" Naomi says, "Yeah, I do. I work for a small agency downtown." Eric says, "That sounds cool. What kind of clients do you work with?" Naomi says, "Mostly restaurants and cafes. We do their social media and help them get more customers." Eric says, "Oh, nice. So, if a place has good Instagram, you might be the reason." Naomi says, "Maybe. I like to think so." Eric says, "Well, I love food, so maybe you can recommend some places." Naomi says, "Definitely. I know so many good spots." Eric says, "I would love that." Naomi says, "How about you? What do you do?" Eric says, "I am a graphic designer. I work freelance, mostly." Naomi says, "Oh, that is interesting. Do you enjoy it?" Eric says, "I do, but it can be lonely sometimes, working from home every day." Naomi says, "I can imagine. I go into an office every day, and some days I wish I could work from home." Eric says, "The grass is always greener, right?" Naomi says, "I guess so. Oh, this pasta is really good, by the way." Eric says, "Right. I got the same thing. I love this place. My friend brought me here last month, and I have been wanting to come back." Naomi says, "Your friend has good taste." Eric says she does. "Actually, she is the one who told me to try online dating. She said I need to get out more." Naomi laughs and says, "Well, she was right about the restaurant." Eric says, "Yeah. Oh, wait, you said you work with restaurants, right? Do you know this place?" Naomi says, "Actually, yes. We did a small campaign for them a while back." Eric says, "No way. That is such a coincidence." Naomi says it really is. Small world. Eric says, "So technically, you helped make this place popular." Naomi says, "I would not go that far, but maybe a little bit." Eric says, "That is amazing. Hey, earlier you said you could recommend good restaurants. Are any of them as good as this one?" Naomi says a few of them, actually. There is a Thai place that is incredible. Eric says, "I love Thai food." Naomi says, "Really?" Eric says, "Yes. My sister lives in Bangkok, actually. She moved there 2 years ago for work." Naomi says, "That is so cool. I have always wanted to visit Thailand." Eric says, "You should. It is beautiful. The food there is on another level." Naomi says, "I bet." "Oh, speaking of food, remember when I said there is a good Thai place here? Eric says, yeah. Naomi says they have the best pad Thai. Eric says, okay, now I really need to go. Naomi says, I will take you. Eric says, that sounds like a second date. Naomi says, maybe it is. They both laugh. Eric says, well, in that case, I am looking forward to it. Oh, and earlier when you said you work from home and it gets lonely, do you ever go to cafes to work? Naomi says sometimes. Why? Eric says there is a cafe near my apartment that has great coffee and big tables. Good for working. Naomi says, oh yeah, that could work. I will check it out. Eric says, and they have really good pastries too. Naomi says, of course you mentioned food again. Eric says, I cannot help it. Food is my love language. Naomi says, noted. Okay, this first date conversation is gold for topic recycling. Let me map it all out for you. They started with Naomi's job in marketing, working with restaurants. Then Eric talked about his graphic design job and working from home being lonely. Then they talked about the pasta at the restaurant. Then Eric mentioned his friend, who recommended the restaurant, and who also told him to try online dating. Then Eric brought back Naomi's job topic by saying, oh wait, you said you work with restaurants, right? And recycled that to connect it to the current restaurant they were sitting in. Then Eric recycled the restaurant recommendation topic from earlier when he said, hey, earlier you said you could recommend good restaurants. Then they talked about a Thai place, which was a new topic, but connected to the restaurant theme. Then Eric mentioned his sister in Bangkok, which was new information. Then Naomi brought back the Thai place topic by saying, oh, speaking of food, remember when I said there is a good Thai place here? Then Eric called it a second date, which recycled the online dating topic from earlier, because the whole reason they were on this date was because of Eric's friend telling him to try online dating. Then Eric brought back Naomi's work from home topic by saying earlier, when you said you work from home and it gets lonely. Then they talked about a cafe. Then Eric mentioned pastries, which brought back the food theme that had been running through the entire conversation. So the topics that kept recycling were Naomi's restaurant work, Eric's loneliness, working from home food and restaurants in general, and the dating context. And the signals they used were things like, oh wait, you said, and hey, earlier you said, and oh, speaking of food, remember when I said? These are slightly more visible signals, but they are still easy to miss if you are not paying attention. Let me test you. What kind of work does Eric do? He is a freelance graphic designer. What kind of clients does Naomi work with? Restaurants and cafes. Who recommended the restaurant to Eric, his friend? Why did Eric's friend tell him to try online dating? She said he needs to get out more. What is the connection between Naomi's job and the restaurant they are eating at? Naomi's agency did a small social media campaign for that restaurant. Where does Eric's sister live? She lives in Bangkok, Thailand. What topic did Eric bring back near the end about Naomi's work situation? He brought back the fact that she works from home, and it gets lonely. What did Eric say is his love language? He said food is his love language, which of course connected to the food and restaurant theme that ran through the entire conversation. You are doing so well. This is advanced listening, and you are handling it like a pro. Now, I want to talk about something that I think will really help you. It is the idea of topic families. Sometimes in a conversation, there is not just one topic being recycled, but a whole family of related topics. Like someone mentions food, and then the conversation moves to travel, and then comes back to food, and then moves to a specific restaurant, and then comes back to travel, and then someone mentions cooking at home, which is related to food, and then someone talks about a grocery store, which is related to both food and the restaurant topic. All of these topics belong to the same family. They are all connected. And when you can recognize that a group of topics belongs to the same family, it becomes much easier to follow the conversation because even when the specific topic changes, you know you are still in the same general area. Think of it like a neighborhood. You might walk down different streets, but you are still in the same neighborhood. So if someone is talking about food, and then shifts to restaurants, and then shifts to cooking, and then shifts to grocery stores, you are still in the food neighborhood. You have not moved to a completely different part of town. This mental framework of topic families will help you feel less lost when conversations jump around, because you will realize that the jumping is happening within a familiar area. Let me give you a quick example of what I mean. Imagine someone says, "I want to learn to play guitar." Then they talk about music for a while. Then they mention a concert they went to. Then they talk about the singer at the concert. Then they talk about the singer's biography. Then they mention that the singer grew up in a small town. Then they talk about small towns in general. Now, at first glance, it might seem like the conversation has drifted far away from the guitar topic. But all of these topics belong to the music family. Guitar music concerts, singers, biographies, they are all connected. And a skilled listener can feel that connection even when the words change. So when you are practicing your listening, try to group topics into families in your head. Ask yourself, is this new topic related to what we were just talking about? Sometimes the answer will be no, and that is fine. But often the answer will be yes, and that will help you stay oriented. All right, let us do another practice conversation, and this time I want you to specifically listen for topic families. See if you can identify the big families that the smaller topics belong to. In this conversation, we have two old friends named Rachel and Dominic, who have not seen each other in a year. They are having dinner together and catching up. Rachel says, "I cannot believe it has been a whole year." Dominic says, "I know it feels like yesterday." Rachel says, "So much has changed." Dominic says, "Tell me about it." Rachel says, "Well, the biggest thing is, I moved." Dominic says, "I heard. You are in Riverside now, right?" Rachel says, "Yeah, I love it. The neighborhood is so quiet and there is a park right across the street from my apartment." Dominic says, "That sounds amazing. I would love to have a park nearby." Rachel says, "You should come visit. You can see it for yourself." Dominic says, "I will take you up on that." Rachel says, "Good. So, how are things with you?" Dominic says, "Things are good. I actually got a promotion at work." Rachel says, "Dominic, that is wonderful. Congratulations." Dominic says, "Thanks. It was a long time coming. I have been there for 4 years, and they finally made me senior manager." Rachel says, "That is a big deal. You must be excited." Dominic says, "I am, but also a little nervous. More responsibility means more stress." Rachel says, "That is true. But you will handle it. You have always been good under pressure." Dominic says, "Remember college when we had that group project and everyone panicked except me?" Rachel says, "Oh my God, yes. Everyone was freaking out, and you just calmly made a plan, and we got an A." Dominic says, "See, I have always been like this." Rachel says, "True. Oh, by the way, you mentioned you have been at the company for 4 years. Do you like the people there? Dominic says, mostly yes. There is one guy on my team who is a bit difficult to work with, but overall it is a good group. Rachel says, difficult how? Dominic says, he just does not listen. He always thinks he knows best. It is frustrating. Rachel says, I had someone like that at my old job. She would interrupt in every meeting. Dominic says the worst type of person. Rachel says, absolutely. Hey, you should come visit me in Riverside. We could go for a walk in the park and get coffee. Dominic says you already invited me like 2 minutes ago. Rachel says, I know. I am just making sure you do not forget. Dominic says, I will not forget. Oh, and the difficult guy at work, his name is Keith. Not that it matters. Rachel says, Keith. Okay. So does Keith report to you now? Dominic says, yes, he does. That is part of the problem. I am supposed to manage him, but he does not respect my authority. Rachel says, that is tough. Maybe you need to have a serious conversation with him. Dominic says, I probably do. Rachel says, you should. You are the senior manager now. Act like it. Dominic says, you are right. I will talk to him next week. Oh, hey, remember when we used to get coffee every morning before class? Rachel says, of course I remember. That was our ritual. Dominic says, I miss those days. Rachel says, me too. Life was simpler. Dominic says it really was. No difficult co-workers, no stress about promotions. Rachel says just exams and group projects. Dominic says, which we handled perfectly, by the way. Rachel says, we did. So, about that visit to Riverside. Dominic says, Rachel, for the 3rd time. Yes, I will come. Rachel says, I am being persistent, because I mean it. I miss you. Dominic says, I miss you too. And I really will come. Maybe next month. Rachel says, next month works. And we will get coffee, just like old times. Dominic says, just like old times. I would like that. Okay, this conversation had so many beautiful layers. Let me break down the topic families first. There is a location family that includes Rachel's move to Riverside, the park, the neighborhood, and the idea of visiting. There is a work and career family that includes Dominic's promotion, his new role as senior manager, his 4 years at the company, the difficult co-worker Keith, and managing people. There is a shared history family that includes the college group project, getting coffee before class, and missing the old days. And there is a friendship family that includes missing each other, Rachel being persistent about the visit, and the invitation to reconnect. Now notice how these families kept overlapping. Rachel mentioned Riverside, then they talked about work. Then Rachel brought back the Riverside visit. Then they talked about Keith. Then Rachel brought back the college memory. Then Dominic connected the college memory back to handling stress, which connected to the work topic. Then they talked about old coffee rituals, which connected to the Riverside visit plan at the end, where Rachel said, "We will get coffee, just like old times." Do you see that? The coffee topic from their college days got recycled at the very end and combined with the Riverside visit topic to create a beautiful conclusion. And Rachel invited Dominic to Riverside 3 separate times in this conversation. That is also a form of recycling. She kept coming back to the same invitation. The first time was casual. The second time she said, "I am just making sure you do not forget." The third time she said, "I am being persistent, because I mean it." Each time the invitation came back, it carried more emotional weight. That is the power of topic recycling. It is not just about information. It is about emotion. Every time a topic comes back, it means something slightly different. The first time someone mentions something, it might just be information. The second time, it might be emphasis. The third time, it might be emotional. Let me ask you my questions now. Where did Rachel move? She moved to Riverside. What is right across the street from her apartment? A park. What promotion did Dominic get? He became senior manager. How long has Dominic been at his company? 4 years. What is the name of his difficult co-worker? Keith. What college memory did Rachel and Dominic share? They had a group project where everyone panicked except Dominic, who calmly made a plan, and they got an A. What was their daily ritual in college? Getting coffee together every morning before class. How many times did Rachel invite Dominic to visit Riverside? 3 times. What topic from college did Rachel connect to the Riverside visit at the end? The coffee ritual. She said they would get coffee just like old times. If you followed all of that, you have truly mastered the art of tracking topic recycling. You are not just hearing words anymore. You are hearing meaning. You are hearing emotion. You are hearing the shape of a real conversation. Now I want to give you one more important tip before we do our final conversations. This tip is about patience. I know that when you are listening to English and the conversation starts, jumping around your instinct is to feel anxious. You think you are missing something. You think you are falling behind. And that anxiety actually makes it harder to understand because your brain is spending energy on worrying instead of listening. So here is what I want you to try. The next time you are in a conversation or watching something in English and the topic suddenly changes or goes back to something old, I want you to take a breath and say to yourself, "This is normal." Just those 3 words. This is normal. Because it is normal. It is the most normal thing in the world. Native speakers do it in every language. It is not a problem. It is not a mistake. It is not poor communication. It is how humans talk. And when you remind yourself that it is normal, you calm down. And when you calm down, your brain can process the language better. It is a simple trick, but it really works. I have seen it help so many of my students. They stop fighting the conversation and start flowing with it. And that is when real understanding happens. All right, let us do a few more conversations, and then we will wrap up with some final thoughts. This next one is between a personal trainer named Jordan and a client named Fiona. They are at the gym finishing a workout session. Jordan says, "Good job today, Fiona." That was a tough one. Fiona says, "It really was. My legs are shaking." Jordan says that means it is working. Fiona says, "If you say so." Jordan says, "I do say so." "So how are you feeling about the progress?" Fiona says, "I feel good. My clothes fit better, and I have more energy." Jordan says, "That is great. Those are the best signs." The scale does not tell the whole story. Fiona says, "I know, but I still weigh myself every morning." Jordan says, "You should not do that. It messes with your head." Fiona says, "I cannot help it." Jordan says, "Try weighing yourself once a week instead. Same day, same time. It will give you a more accurate picture." Fiona says, "Okay, I will try." "Oh, by the way, my sister wants to start coming to the gym." Jordan says, "That is great. Bring her in." Fiona says she is nervous, though. She has never been to a gym before. Jordan says, "Tell her everyone starts somewhere. No one is judging." Fiona says, "I will tell her that." She also wants to lose weight, but she wants to do it in a healthy way. Jordan says, "Smart. Crash diets do not work. Consistency is what matters." Fiona says, "That is basically what you tell me every session." Jordan says, because it is true, and you need to hear it repeatedly. Fiona says, fair enough. Hey, remember last week you asked me about my eating habits? Jordan says, yeah. Fiona says I started meal prepping on Sundays. Jordan says, Fiona, that is fantastic. How is it going? Fiona says it is actually easier than I thought. I make a big batch of chicken and rice and vegetables, and then I have lunch ready for the whole week. Jordan says that is exactly what I recommend. It saves time and money and keeps you on track. Fiona says, I know. My sister wants to learn how to do it too. Jordan said, see, your sister is already learning from you. Fiona says, yeah. Oh, and about the weighing myself thing. I think once a week is a good idea. I will start next Monday. Jordan says, perfect. And Fiona, seriously, the meal prepping is a game changer. Fiona says, you already said that. Jordan says, I know, but I want to emphasize it. Fiona says, noted. So, same time Thursday. Jordan says, same time Thursday. And tell your sister to come any time. Fiona says, I will. Oh, wait, I forgot to tell you. I tried that protein shake you recommended. Jordan says the chocolate one. Fiona says yes. It was actually really good. I was surprised because I usually do not like protein shakes. Jordan says told you. Fiona says yeah. But I only drink it after workouts, right? Jordan says yes, after workouts is best. It helps your muscles recover. Fiona says, okay. And I should keep doing the meal prepping. Jordan says, Fiona, you are recycling all my advice back to me. Fiona laughs and says, I am just making sure I remember. Jordan says, you are doing great, honestly. Fiona says, thanks, Jordan. See you Thursday. Jordan says, see you Thursday. This gym conversation is a perfect example of how topic recycling can be used for confirmation and emphasis. Notice how many times topics came back in this short conversation. Fiona mentioned weighing herself every morning. Jordan said weigh yourself once a week. Then later, Fiona brought back the weighing topic herself, saying about the weighing myself thing, I think once a week is a good idea. She recycled it to confirm that she was going to follow the advice. Then Jordan mentioned meal prepping and praised Fiona for doing it. Then Fiona brought it back again, saying, my sister wants to learn how to do it too. Then Jordan said, the meal prepping is a game changer. Then Fiona pointed out that Jordan already said that which was a meta moment where she called out the recycling itself. Then Fiona brought back the protein shake topic at the very end and asked for confirmation about when to drink it. Then she brought back the meal prepping one more time. And then Jordan noticed the pattern and said, you are recycling all my advice back to me. This is such an interesting type of recycling because it is not about the conversation drifting naturally. It is about the listener deliberately bringing topics back to make sure they understood and remembered. And this is actually a great strategy for you as an English learner. If you are in a conversation and you want to make sure you understood something, you can recycle the topic yourself. You can say something like so about what you said earlier or going back to that thing you mentioned. It shows the other person that you were listening, and it gives you a chance to confirm your understanding. It is a powerful communication tool. Let me ask my questions. What progress has Fiona noticed? Her clothes fit better, and she has more energy. What does Jordan say about the scale? He says the scale does not tell the whole story. Who wants to start coming to the gym? Fiona's sister. Why is the sister nervous? She has never been to a gym before. What new habit has Fiona started? Meal prepping on Sundays. What does Fiona make for her meal prep? Chicken, rice, and vegetables. What protein shake did Fiona try? The chocolate one that Jordan recommended. What did Jordan notice about the way Fiona was talking at the end? He noticed she was recycling all his advice back to him. Fiona even admitted she was doing it to make sure she remembers. This is such a practical conversation because it shows you that topic recycling is not just something that happens to you. It is something you can do on purpose to improve your communication. Okay, here is our next conversation, and it is a phone call between two people who used to date but broke up a year ago. They have not spoken in months. The characters are named Scott and Vanessa. This conversation is emotionally complex, and the topic recycling reflects that complexity. Listen carefully. Scott says, "Hey, Vanessa, thanks for picking up." Vanessa says, "Hey, Scott, of course. You said it was important." Scott says, "Yeah, I have been thinking a lot lately, and I wanted to talk." Vanessa says, "Okay." "About what?" Scott says, "About us. About what happened." Vanessa says, "Scott, we have been through this already." Scott says, "I know, but I have been doing some thinking, and I wanted to share something with you." Vanessa says, "Okay." Scott says, "I have been seeing a therapist actually, for the past few months." Vanessa says, "Really?" Scott says, "Yeah. And she helped me understand some things about why our relationship fell apart." Vanessa says, "Like what?" Scott says, "Like I had a really hard time communicating. Not just with you, but in general. I would shut down when things got difficult instead of talking about it." Vanessa says, "You definitely did that." Scott says, "I know. And I am not making excuses. I just wanted you to know that I recognize it now." Vanessa says, "I appreciate you saying that." Scott says, "There is something else, too. Do you remember that weekend we went to the coast?" Vanessa says, "Of course I remember." Scott says, "Do you remember what happened on the Saturday night?" Vanessa says, "We had that argument on the beach." Scott says, "Yeah. And you told me you felt like I did not care about your feelings." Vanessa says, "I remember." Scott says, "I got defensive and I walked away. And I have regretted that moment every single day since." Vanessa says, "Scott." Scott says, "I am not saying this to try to get you back. I just needed to say it out loud to you." Vanessa says, "I hear you. I really do. And honestly, I have thought about that night too." Scott says, "You have." Vanessa says, "Yes. I think about it a lot, actually. I think about all the times I wanted you to just open up and you could not." Scott says, "I could not then. But I am working on it now." Vanessa says, "I am glad." Scott says, "How are you doing, by the way?" Vanessa says, "I am good. I started a new job, actually." Scott says, "Really? Doing what?" Vanessa says, "I am working at a bookstore now." Scott says, "You always loved bookstores." Vanessa says, "I do. It is peaceful. And I am around books all day, which is my favorite thing." Scott says, "That sounds perfect for you." Vanessa says it really is. "Oh, speaking of books, do you remember that novel I was reading when we were together? The one about the woman who travels alone?" Scott says vaguely. Vanessa says, "I finished it. And I thought about you when I read the ending." Scott says, "Why?" Vanessa says, "Because the main character learns to be okay with being alone. And at the time I was reading it, I was so afraid of being alone after our breakup. But when I finished it, I realized that being alone is not the same as being lonely." Scott says that is deep. Vanessa says, "I know. But it helped me a lot. And honestly, it helped me understand our relationship better, too." Scott says, "How so?" Vanessa says, "Because I think part of the reason I was so frustrated with you was that I was depending on you to make me feel less alone. And that was not fair to you." Scott says, Vanessa. Vanessa says, no, let me finish. I am not saying you did not have faults. You did. The communication thing was real. But I had my own things to work on too. Scott says, I guess we both had growing to do. Vanessa says, yeah. So the therapy is helping. Scott says it is. A lot, actually. I am learning to express my feelings instead of hiding them. Vanessa says, that is really good, Scott. I am happy for you. Scott says, thanks. And the bookstore job sounds wonderful. Vanessa says, it is. Hey, going back to that night at the coast. Scott says, yeah. Vanessa says, I forgive you. For walking away. Scott says, thank you. That means more than you know. Vanessa says, I know. We are okay, Scott. We are different people now, but we are okay. Scott says, yeah, we are okay. That was an emotional one, wasn't it? Let me show you how the topic recycling in this conversation was not just about keeping track of information. It was about emotional resolution. The conversation started with Scott bringing up the topic of their relationship. Then he introduced the topic of therapy, which was new. Then the therapy topic led to the topic of communication problems, which was connected to their relationship. Then Scott brought up the specific memory of the weekend at the coast, which was a recycled topic from their past. Then Vanessa confirmed she remembered the argument on the beach. Then Scott described what happened that night and expressed regret. Then the conversation shifted to Vanessa's new job at the bookstore. Then Vanessa connected the bookstore to books in general. Then she brought up the novel she was reading during their relationship, which was another recycled topic from the past. Then she connected the theme of the novel about being alone to her feelings after the breakup, which connected back to the relationship topic. Then she connected her own growth back to the communication problems Scott had mentioned, which was another recycling of the therapy topic. Then Scott brought back the therapy topic by saying the therapy is helping. Then Vanessa brought back the bookstore topic briefly. Then she explicitly recycled the coast topic by saying going back to that night at the coast. And she used that recycled topic to offer forgiveness. The forgiveness would not have had the same impact if she had just said, I forgive you out of nowhere. She needed to bring the conversation back to that specific night on the beach to give the forgiveness context and meaning. And then Scott thanked her, which connected back to the regret he expressed earlier when he first brought up the coast memory. So the whole conversation was a series of emotional threads being woven together. The relationship topic, the therapy topic, the coast memory, the book, the breakup, feelings, the communication problems. They all kept coming back, and each time they came back, they carried more emotional weight. This is the deepest level of topic recycling, and it is the kind of thing that makes real human communication so powerful and so beautiful. Let me ask you my final set of questions for this part. Why did Scott call Vanessa? He wanted to talk about their relationship and share what he had learned in therapy. What did Scott's therapist help him understand? That he had a hard time communicating and would shut down when things got difficult. What happened on the Saturday night at the coast? They had an argument on the beach, and Vanessa told Scott she felt like he did not care about her feelings, and he got defensive and walked away. What is Vanessa's new job? She works at a bookstore. What was the novel about that Vanessa was reading during their relationship? It was about a woman who travels alone and learns to be okay with being alone. What did Vanessa realize about herself through the novel. She realized she was depending on Scott to make her feel less alone, and that was not fair to him. Why did Vanessa bring back the topic of the night at the coast at the end? To tell Scott she forgives him for walking away that night. What was the final thing Scott said? He said, "We are okay." If your eyes are even a little bit moist right now, it is because you did not just understand the words. You understood the human beings behind the words. And that is what English in Fluency is all about. Now I want to tie everything together and push your listening skills to a level you might not even realize you are capable of reaching. I want to introduce the last piece of the puzzle, and that is what I call layered recycling. Layered recycling is when a conversation recycles not just one old topic, but 2 or 3 old topics, all at the same time, and connects them into one single moment. It sounds complicated, but once I show you what it looks like, you will realize you have actually experienced it before. You just did not have a name for it. So let me explain with a quick example before we jump into the practice. Imagine 2 friends are talking, and one of them says, "You know, when we talked about my job problems last week, and you suggested I talk to my boss, and then we also talked about how my sister is going through the same thing at her workplace. Well, I finally talked to my boss, and it went well, and I told my sister about it, and she is going to talk to her boss too." Do you see what happened there? In one single sentence, the person recycled 3 separate old topics: the job problem, the advice to talk to the boss, and the sister's similar situation. All 3 threads came together at once. That is layered recycling, and it is one of the most satisfying things to catch when you are listening to English, because it means you truly understood the full picture of the conversation. It means you were holding all those threads in your mind, and when they came together, it felt like completing a puzzle. So in this final stretch, I want you to listen for these layered moments. They might be subtle, but when you catch them, it will feel amazing. Let us get started. Here is our next conversation, and it features layered recycling right from the beginning. The characters are 2 people who work together in a small office. One is named Laura, and the other is named Peter. They are in the break room at work making coffee and chatting before their shift starts. Laura says, "I cannot believe it is only Tuesday. This week is dragging." Peter says, "Tell me about it." Monday felt like it was 3 days long. Laura says, "I had so many emails yesterday. I answered like 40, and there were still more waiting this morning." Peter says, "That is rough. My Monday was not much better. I had that big meeting with the client from hell." Laura says, "Oh no. The one who keeps changing the requirements?" Peter says, "The very same one. We sat there for 2 hours, and at the end she said she wants to completely redesign the whole thing." Laura says, "You are kidding." Peter says, "I wish I was. I wanted to scream." Laura says, "I would have screamed." Peter says, "I came close. Anyway, enough about work. Did you do anything fun last night?" Laura says, "Not really. I went home, made dinner, and watched that new show everyone is talking about." Peter says, "Oh, what is it called?" Laura says, "I think it is called Midnight Garden or something like that." Peter says, "Is it good?" Laura says, "Honestly, it is okay. The acting is great, but the story is a bit slow." Peter says, "I started watching it too, but I only got through the first episode." Laura says the first episode is the slowest one. It gets better in episode 3. Peter says, "Good to know. Oh, by the way, I meant to ask you, Remember, you told me last month about that online course you were taking. The writing one. Laura says, oh yeah. The creative writing course. Peter says, right. How is that going? Laura says, it is going really well, actually. I just finished my 4th assignment. Peter says, that is impressive. You barely have time to breathe with this job. Laura says, I know, but the course is only on weekends, so I make it work. Peter says, what are you writing about? Laura says, right now I am writing a short story about a woman who moves to a small town and discovers a secret about her neighbors. Peter says, that sounds interesting. Kind of like a mystery. Laura says a little bit yes. The woman is actually a lot like the main character in that show I was just telling you about. Peter says, really? Laura says, yeah. The show character also moves to a new place and discovers secrets. I think I was subconsciously inspired by it. Peter says that is funny. So the show you think is just okay actually influenced your writing. Laura says, I guess so. Art inspires art, right? Peter says, I guess so. Hey, going back to the client, from hell. I just remembered something. Laura says, what? Peter says, remember last month when you had that client who kept rejecting your designs over and over? Laura says, oh God, do not remind me. Peter says, well, the reason I bring it up is that my client from hell actually reminded me of your situation. Laura says, how so? Peter says, because just like your client kept changing their mind, my client keeps changing the requirements. It is the exact same pattern. And you told me back then that the best thing to do was set clear boundaries in writing. Laura says, I did say that. Peter says, so I took your advice. I sent my client an email yesterday after the meeting outlining exactly what is included in the project and what would cost extra. Laura says, Peter, that is brilliant. Did they respond? Peter says, not yet, but I feel better just having done it. Laura says, good. You know what is funny, though? Both of us are dealing with difficult clients. Both of us are watching the same show. And both of us are doing things outside of work to keep ourselves sane. You have your client drama, and I have my writing course. It is like we are living parallel lives. Peter says, I never thought of it that way, but you are right. Laura says, we should start a support group. Peter says, a support group for overworked people who watch mediocre shows. Laura says, exactly. We can meet right here in this break room every Tuesday. Peter says, I am in. Oh, and I am going to keep watching that show, by the way. If it inspired you to write a story, it cannot be that bad. Laura says, see episode 3. You will thank me. Peter says, fine. But if episode 3 is also slow, I am blaming you. Laura says, deal. Okay. Let me unpack everything that happened in this conversation, because it was full of layered recycling. They started by talking about their stressful work week. Laura mentioned having too many emails, and Peter mentioned his difficult client. Then they shifted to talking about the TV show called Midnight Garden. Then Peter brought up Laura's creative writing course from a previous conversation, which was the first recycling moment. Then Laura connected the writing course to the TV show by saying her story was inspired by the show, which was a layered recycling connecting two current topics. Then Peter brought back the difficult client topic by saying, going back to the client from hell. Then he layered that with another recycled topic from a previous conversation about Laura's old client who kept rejecting designs. So in one moment, Peter connected his current client problem to Laura's past client problem and to the advice Laura had given him about setting boundaries. That is 3 threads coming together at once. Then Laura confirmed she had given that advice. Then Peter explained that he used her advice and sent an email to his client. Then Laura did the biggest layered recycling of the entire conversation when she pointed out that both of them are dealing with difficult clients, and both are watching the same show, and both are doing things outside of work to cope. She wove together the work stress topic, the TV show topic, and the personal growth topic into one observation. That is beautiful layered recycling. And then, at the end, Peter brought back the TV show topic one more time, connecting it to the writing course topic by saying, if it inspired you to write a story, it cannot be that bad. So the 2 topics that seemed unrelated at first became connected through the writing inspiration. Let me ask you some questions. What TV show were Laura and Peter discussing? It is called Midnight Garden. What did Laura say about the show? She said, the acting is great, but the story is slow, and it gets better in episode 3. What online course is Laura taking? A creative writing course on weekends? What is Laura's short story about? A woman who moves to a small town and discovers a secret about her neighbors. What connection did Laura make between the show and her story? She realized her story was subconsciously inspired by the show because both main characters move to new places and discover secrets. What advice had Laura given Peter in a previous conversation about handling difficult clients? She said to set clear boundaries in writing. What did Peter do with that advice? He sent his client an email outlining exactly what is included in the project and what would cost extra. What 3 things did Laura say they have in common in their parallel lives? They are both dealing with difficult clients, they are both watching the same show, and they are both doing things outside of work to stay sane. What did Peter say at the very end that connected the show and the writing course? He said, if the show inspired Laura to write a story, then the show cannot be that bad. If you caught all of those layers, you have absolutely crushed this exercise. You are not just following single threads anymore. You are following multiple threads that weave together, and that is an incredibly advanced skill. Let us move on to the next conversation. This one is between a grandfather named Walter and his granddaughter named Sophie. Sophie is 19 years old, and she just finished her first year of college. She is visiting Walter at his house for the weekend. Walter says, Sophie, it is so good to see you. Come sit down. I made tea. Sophie says, thanks, Grandpa. This house smells amazing. What did you bake? Walter says, your grandmother's apple cake. Sophie says, oh, Grandpa, you still make that? Walter says, every time you visit. Sophie says, I know. It makes me emotional every time. Walter says me too, but in a good way. So tell me about college. How was the first year? Sophie says it was good. Hard, but good. I learned a lot. Walter says good. Are you enjoying the classes? Sophie says most of them, yes. There was one philosophy class that I absolutely loved. Walter says philosophy. That was always my favorite subject when I was young. Sophie says, really? I did not know that. Walter says, oh yes. I wanted to be a philosophy professor before I went into business. Sophie says, Grandpa, you wanted to be a professor. Walter says, I did. Life had other plans. Sophie says, what happened? Walter says, my father got sick, and I had to take over the family shop. So I put my dreams on hold, and I never went back to them. Sophie says, that is sad. Walter says, it is life. I do not regret it. The shop put food on the table, and it paid for your mother's education, which eventually led to you. So everything connects. Sophie says, I guess so. But do you ever think about what would have happened if you had followed that dream? Walter says sometimes, not in a sad way, just in a curious way. Like what if? Sophie says, I think about what if a lot. Walter says about what? Sophie says about my major, actually. I am studying business like you did, but I keep wondering if I should have studied something more creative. Walter says, like what? Sophie says, like writing, maybe. Or art. I have always loved writing stories. Walter says, Sophie, you are telling this to the wrong person because I will always tell you to follow your creative dreams. Sophie says, I know, but I am scared. What if I change my major and then I cannot find a job? Walter says, what if you do not change your major and you spend your whole life wondering? Sophie says, that is exactly what my professor said. Walter says, your philosophy professor. Sophie says, yeah. He told us that the unexamined life is not worth living. Walter says Socrates said that. Sophie says, I know. My professor said it too. Walter says your professor sounds like a wise man. Sophie says he is. He actually encouraged me to take a creative writing class next semester just to try it. Walter says, and what did you say? Sophie says, I said I would think about it. Walter says, Sophie. Sophie says, I know, I know. Walter says, remember what I just told you about my dream of being a philosophy professor? Sophie says, yeah. Walter says I put that dream on hold, and I never went back to it. I am not bitter about it, but I want something different for you. I do not want you to put your dreams on hold. Sophie says, but Grandpa, you turned out fine. Walter says I did. But I was lucky. And you might be fine too, whatever you choose. But if there is a chance to explore something you love, why not take it? Sophie says, you sound just like my professor. Walter says, then, your professor is a smart man. Sophie says he also said something else that reminded me of you, actually. Walter says, what? Sophie says he said that the choices we make when we are young define the shape of our whole lives. And when you said, the shop paid for my mother's education, which eventually led to you, I thought of that quote. Walter says, well, your professor is right about that too. My choice to run the shop, instead of studying philosophy, shaped everything. It led to your mother. It led to you being here right now, eating apple cake. Sophie says, so every choice matters. Walter says, every single one. Sophie says, even small ones. Walter says, especially small ones. Sophie says, so taking one creative writing class could change my life. Walter says, it could. Or it could just be a fun class. Either way, you win. Sophie says, Grandpa, when did you get so wise? Walter says, I was always this wise. I just did not have anyone to share it with until you came along. Sophie laughs and says, sure, Grandpa. Can I have another piece of apple cake? Walter says you can have as much as you want. Your grandmother would want it that way. Sophie says I miss her. Walter says me too. Every day. Sophie says I think she would tell me to take the writing class. Walter says she absolutely would. She was the bravest person I ever knew. Sophie says, where do you think I get my writing from? Walter says probably from her. She used to write poetry when she was young. Did you know that? Sophie says no, she never told me. Walter says she was too modest to share it. But she had notebooks full of poems. Sophie says I have her notebooks, actually. They are in a box in my closet. I have been meaning to read them. Walter says you should. And when you take that writing class, you can carry her spirit with you. Sophie says now I definitely have to take the class. Walter says, "Good." And Sophie, "Whatever you decide, I am proud of you. First year of college done, and already thinking about the big questions. That takes courage." Sophie says, "Thanks, Grandpa. This was exactly the conversation I needed today." Walter says, "That is what grandfathers are for. Now, eat your cake before it gets cold." This conversation between Walter and Sophie was so rich with layered recycling that I almost do not know where to start. Let me map it out carefully. They started by talking about the apple cake, which connected to Sophie's grandmother who has passed away. That set an emotional foundation for the whole conversation. Then they talked about college and Sophie's philosophy class. Then Walter revealed he wanted to be a philosophy professor, which connected to Sophie's philosophy class. Then Walter explained why he did not follow that dream, connecting it to the family shop, and then to Sophie's mother, and then to Sophie herself. That was a chain of connections linking past, present, and future. Then Sophie brought up her own dream of writing. Then Walter encouraged her. Then Sophie mentioned her professor's advice. Then Walter connected the professor's advice back to his own story about not following his dream. Then Sophie explicitly made a layered connection when she said her professor's quote about choices defining our lives reminded her of Walter saying the shop led to her mother, which led to her. She connected the philosophy quote to Walter's personal story in one beautiful moment. Then Walter expanded on that connection, saying every choice matters. Then Sophie applied it to herself, saying taking one writing class could change her life. Then Walter brought back the grandmother topic by saying your grandmother would want you to take the class. Then Sophie said she thinks she gets her writing from her grandmother. Then Walter revealed that the grandmother used to write poetry, which was a brand new piece of information that connected all the way back to Sophie's desire to write, and all the way back to the apple cake, and the grandmother's presence. Then Sophie said she has her grandmother's poetry notebooks. Then Walter connected the notebooks to the writing class, saying she could carry her grandmother's spirit with her. And that final connection brought together the grandmother, the writing, the philosophy, the choices, and the dreams all into one single moment. It was like every thread in the conversation came together at the end. This is the most advanced form of topic recycling, and it is incredibly powerful emotionally. Let me ask you the questions. What did Walter bake for Sophie? His wife's apple cake. What did Walter want to be before he went into business? A philosophy professor. Why did Walter not follow that dream? His father got sick, and he had to take over the family shop. What is Sophie considering changing to? Something more creative like writing or art. What did Sophie's philosophy professor tell her? That the unexamined life is not worth living and that she should take a creative writing class. What quote did Sophie connect to Walter's story about the shop? Her professor said the choices we make when we are young define the shape of our whole lives, and Sophie connected it to Walter, saying the shop led to her mother, which led to her. What secret did Walter reveal about Sophie's grandmother? She used to write poetry and had notebooks full of poems. What does Sophie have in her closet? Her grandmother's poetry notebooks. How did Walter connect the notebooks to the writing class? He said Sophie could carry her grandmother's spirit with her when she takes the class. Every single question required you to follow a thread that wove through the entire conversation. And you did it. Now I want to take a moment to talk about something I think is really important for your overall English journey. When you practice listening like this, and you train your brain to follow topic recycling, you are not just becoming a better listener. You are becoming a better speaker too, because the way people listen and the way people speak are deeply connected. When you understand how native speakers recycle topics in conversation, you start to naturally do it yourself when you speak. You start to say things like, "Remember when you mentioned," or "going back to what we were talking about," or "that reminds me of something you said earlier." And when you do that, your English sounds more natural, more fluent, more human. It makes the other person feel like you are truly present in the conversation because you are holding on to what they said and bringing it back. That is an incredibly powerful communication skill, and it works in every language, not just English. So the listening practice you are doing right now is actually making you a better communicator in general. Keep that in mind. It should motivate you to keep practicing even on days when it feels hard. All right, let us do our next conversation. This one is between two roommates named Nina and Carlos. They are in their apartment at night, and one of them is stressed about money. This conversation has a lot of practical recycling that you might encounter in everyday situations. Carlos says, "Nina, can I talk to you about something?" Nina says, "Of course. What is up?" Carlos says, "I am kind of stressed about money right now." Nina says, "Really? You always seem fine with money." Carlos says, "I look fine on the outside, but inside I am panicking a little." Nina says, "Tell me what is going on." Carlos says, "My rent went up this month, and my phone bill was higher than usual, because I went over my data, and I have not been getting enough hours at work." Nina says that is a lot of things hitting at once. Carlos says exactly. "And I have been eating out too much, which does not help." Nina says, "How much are you short?" Carlos says, "Maybe $200 this month." Nina says, "Okay, that is stressful, but it is not impossible to fix." Carlos says, "I feel stupid for letting it get to this point." Nina says, "Do not feel stupid. Money stuff happens to everyone." "Hey, remember last year when I had that emergency with my car?" Carlos says the brake thing. Nina says, "Yes. I had to pay $800. I did not plan for, and I thought I was going to have to move out because I could not afford rent." Carlos says, "Right, but you figured it out." Nina says, "I did." "And do you know how?" Carlos says, "How?" Nina says, "I sat down and made a strict budget. I wrote down every single thing I spent money on for a month, and I found so many places where I was wasting money without realizing it." Carlos says, "Like, what?" Nina says, "Like subscriptions I was not using. I had 3 streaming services, and I only watched one of them. I had a gym membership I went to maybe twice. Little things like that." Carlos says, "I probably have subscriptions I do not use." Nina says, "You definitely do. I see you paying for things on your phone all the time." Carlos says that is true. Nina says, "So step 1 is look at your subscriptions and cancel the ones you do not need." Carlos says, "Okay, what is step 2? Nina says step 2 is the eating out thing. You order food delivery like every other day." Carlos says, "I know. I am lazy about cooking." Nina says, "So was I. But I started meal prepping on Sundays. I told you about this before." Carlos says, "Oh, right. You make a bunch of food on Sunday, and then you have meals for the week." Nina says, "Exactly. It saves so much money. Like honestly, Carlos, I was spending over $300 a month on delivery, And now I spend maybe 100 on groceries. Carlos says, that is a huge difference. Nina says, it really is. And step 3 is the work hours thing. Can you ask for more shifts? Carlos says, I can try. They have been cutting hours for everyone, though. Nina says, have you talked to your manager about it? Carlos says, not yet. I have been avoiding the conversation. Nina says, Carlos, remember what you told me when I was stressed about my car situation? Carlos says, what did I say? Nina says, you said, do not avoid the hard conversations, because avoiding them only makes the problem bigger. Carlos says, I said that. Nina says, you did. And it was good advice. I used it when I talked to my landlord about my rent issue. Carlos says, oh, right. You negotiated a smaller increase. Nina says, exactly. Because I followed your advice and had the conversation instead of avoiding it. Carlos says, so you are using my own advice against me. Nina says, I am using your own advice for you. Now you need to talk to your manager and ask for more hours. Carlos says you are right. Nina says, I know I am right. Oh, and one more thing. The phone bill. Call your provider and ask if they have a cheaper plan. I did that last year, and they gave me a plan that was $15 cheaper for basically the same thing. Carlos says they can do that. Nina says they can. You just have to ask. Carlos says, so let me recap. Cancel unused subscriptions. Start meal prepping talk to my manager about hours, and call my phone company. Nina says 4 steps. That is it. Carlos says, what about the rent increase? Nina says that one you cannot control right now. Focus on the things you can control, and the $200 gap will close. Carlos says, Nina, you are amazing. Nina says, I am not amazing. I just learned all of this the hard way through my own money problems. Carlos says, which you just recycled through this entire conversation. Nina says, I did. Because the solutions to your problems are the same solutions I used for my problems. Carlos says, I guess money problems are pretty universal. Nina says they really are. Oh, and speaking of universal problems, remember when we had that issue with the electric bill last summer? Carlos says the one that was way too high because the air conditioning was broken. Nina says yes. And we called the electric company, and they found an error and gave us a credit. Carlos says you are saying I should check my phone bill for errors too. Nina says I am saying always check your bills. Always question them. Carlos says you are like a financial guru. Nina says I am a person who has made a lot of money mistakes and learned from them. That is all. Carlos says, well, I am grateful. Nina says, I know. Now go cancel those subscriptions. I can hear 3 different notification sounds on your phone right now, and at least one of them is probably something you pay for and do not use. Carlos looks at his phone and says, actually, you are right. I pay for a meditation app I have not opened in months. Nina says, there you go. That is your first $15 back. Carlos says, thank you, Nina. Seriously. Nina says, you are welcome. Now make me some of that meal prep food. Carlos says, I have not started meal prepping yet. Nina says, I know. I am joking. But start on Sunday. Carlos says, I will. Nina says, you better. This was such a practical and useful conversation, and the recycling in it was incredibly smooth. Let me show you how it all worked. Carlos started by talking about his money problems. Nina brought back her own car emergency from last year as a way to relate and offer solutions. That was the first recycling moment, and it set up the entire framework for the advice that followed. Then Nina brought back the meal prepping topic from a previous conversation when she said, "I told you about this before." Then Nina recycled Carlos's own advice from the car emergency situation when she reminded him that he had told her not to avoid hard conversations. This is a really special type of recycling where someone brings back advice that was given to them and applies it back to the person who gave it. Then Carlos noticed the pattern and said, "You are using my own advice against me?" Then Nina recycled the landlord negotiation topic from the car emergency story to show that the advice had worked for her. Then Nina brought back her own phone company experience from last year to give Carlos another specific tip. Then, at the end, Nina recycled the electric bill issue from last summer to suggest Carlos check his phone bill for errors. So, Nina recycled 4 separate past experiences throughout this conversation. Her car emergency, her meal prepping discovery, Carlos's advice about not avoiding conversations, her phone company negotiation, and the electric bill error. And she wove all of them into a single coherent set of advice for Carlos. Every time she recycled a past topic, she used it to solve a piece of Carlos's current problem. This is the most practical form of topic recycling, and you will hear it all the time when people are giving advice or helping each other. Let me test you. What 3 things caused Carlos's money stress? His rent went up, his phone bill was higher because of data overage, and he was not getting enough hours at work. What was Nina's car emergency from last year? She had to pay $800 for brakes and thought she would have to move out. What solution did Nina find for her own money problems? She made a strict budget and found subscriptions and memberships she was not using. What specific subscriptions did Nina cancel? 3 streaming services she only used 1, and a gym membership she rarely used. What advice had Carlos given Nina during her car emergency? He told her not to avoid hard conversations, because avoiding them only makes the problem bigger. How did Nina use that advice herself? She talked to her landlord and negotiated a smaller rent increase. What 4 steps did Nina give Carlos? Cancel unused subscriptions, start meal prepping talk to his manager about more hours, and call his phone company for a cheaper plan. What past bill issue did Nina bring up at the very end? The electric bill from last summer that had an error and resulted in a credit. What subscription did Carlos find on his phone that he does not use? A meditation app. You followed every single piece of advice and every single recycled memory. That is real-world listening comprehension, and you nailed it. Okay, here is our absolute final practice conversation, and I want to make it count. This one is a group conversation with 3 people at a dinner party. The host is a woman named Claire, and her 2 guests are a married couple named Brian and Michelle. Group conversations are the hardest for topic recycling because there are more people, which means more threads and more chaos. But if you can follow this one, you can follow almost anything. Claire says, "Can I get anyone more wine?" Brian says, "I am good, thank you." Michelle says, "I will have a little more, please." Claire pours the wine and says, "So how have you 2 been? It feels like forever since we had dinner." Brian says it has been at least 2 months. Michelle says 3. "The last time was your birthday party, Claire." Claire says, "Oh my God, you are right. My birthday. That feels like a different lifetime." Brian says a lot has happened since then. Claire says it really has. "I started my new job." Michelle says, "Oh, that is right. How is it going?" Claire says it is going well. The people are nice, and the work is interesting. But the commute is longer than I expected. Brian says, "Where is the office?" Claire says, "Downtown." It takes me about 50 minutes each way. Michelle says, "That is rough." Brian used to have a commute like that. Brian says, "Yeah, when I worked at the old office before they moved. It was 45 minutes, and it drained the life out of me." Claire says that is exactly how I feel. Drained. Michelle says, "Have you thought about taking the train instead of driving?" Claire says I have. But the train station is 20 minutes from my house, so it does not save much time. Brian says, "What about listening to podcasts or audiobooks?" That is what I did when I had my long commute. Claire says that is actually a good idea. What did you listen to? Brian says mostly history podcasts. There is one about ancient civilizations that is incredible. Claire says, "I love history." Michelle says, "You love history." Brian loves history. You two should exchange podcast recommendations. Claire says, "Definitely." What is it called? Brian says it is called Echoes of Time. Claire says I am writing that down. Michelle says you two are going to be history podcast buddies now? Brian laughs and says, apparently, "Oh, Claire, this food is amazing, by the way. What is this dish?" Claire says it is a mushroom risotto. Michelle said she does not eat meat, so I wanted to make something special. Michelle says, "Claire, you did not have to do that." Claire says, "I wanted to. You are my guests." Michelle says that is so thoughtful. Brian says she is always thoughtful. Remember our anniversary dinner last year? Michelle says, "Oh my God." Claire says what happened. Michelle says Claire cooked us a 3-course meal for our anniversary. It was the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for us. Claire says it was nothing. Brian says it was not nothing. You spent the whole day cooking. Claire says I like cooking for people I care about. Michelle says, "Well, we appreciated it so much." Speaking of cooking, do you remember that cooking class we took together? Claire says the Italian one. Michelle says yes. That was so fun. We learned how to make fresh pasta. Claire says, and we were terrible at it at first. Michelle says our pasta looked like a disaster, but it tasted good. Claire says it did. We should do another class sometime. Michelle says I would love that. Brian says I would love that too. Claire says maybe a French cooking class this time. Michelle says, "Ooh, French." Even better. Oh, wait, I just remembered something. Brian, you said earlier that you used to listen to history podcasts during your commute. Brian says, "Yeah." Michelle says, "Did you keep listening to them after your commute got shorter?" Brian says, "Honestly, no. Once my commute changed, I stopped." Claire says that is a shame. Brian says, "I know. I keep meaning to go back to it, but I never do." Michelle says, "You should. Oh, and Claire, you should start listening to that podcast right away. It will make your commute feel shorter." Claire says, "I will download it tonight." Brian says, "And if you like it, there is a whole episode about the history of Italian food." Claire says, "Wait, history and Italian food in one podcast?" Brian says, "Yes." Michelle says Claire is going to lose her mind. Claire says I absolutely am. This connects everything. The history podcast, the Italian cooking class we took. It is all coming together. Brian says, "See, the universe works in mysterious ways." Michelle says, or Claire just really likes history and Italian food. Claire says both. Definitely both. Brian says, "Hey, going back to the commute thing, have you talked to your boss about flexible hours?" Claire says a little. "They said I could work from home 1 day a week starting next month." Michelle says that is great. Claire says it is. One less day of driving, Brian says, and one more day to listen to history podcasts at home. Claire laughs and says, I see what you did there. Michelle says he is going to connect everything to that podcast now. Brian says, I am just being thorough. This group conversation was a beautiful web of recycling. Let me trace all the threads. They started by talking about how long it has been since they last met, which led to Claire's birthday party memory. Then they talked about Claire's new job and her long commute. Then Brian recycled his own past commute experience, connecting it to Claire's current situation. Then Brian recommended podcasts, which was a solution connected to the commute topic. Then Claire showed interest in the history podcast, which created a new subtopic. Then Michelle noticed that both Claire and Brian love history. Then Brian brought up the food, which led to Claire explaining she made mushroom risotto for Michelle, who does not eat meat. Then Brian recycled the memory of their anniversary dinner, where Claire cooked a 3-course meal. Then Claire said she likes cooking for people she cares about, which connected the food topic to the friendship topic. Then Michelle recycled a memory of a cooking class she and Claire took together. Then they planned to take a French cooking class, which was a future connection to the recycled cooking class topic. Then Michelle brought back Brian's podcast topic by asking if he kept listening after his commute changed. Then Michelle connected the podcast back to Claire's commute, saying it would make her commute feel shorter. Then Brian mentioned that the podcast has an episode about Italian food history. Then Claire pointed out that this connected the history podcast to the Italian cooking class memory in one layered moment. Then Brian brought back the commute topic one more time, asking about flexible hours. Then Claire shared that she can work from home 1 day a week. Then Brian connected working from home to listening to podcasts. So the topics that kept cycling were the commute history podcasts, food and cooking, the anniversary dinner, the cooking class, and Claire's birthday. And they all kept overlapping and connecting to each other in different combinations. It was like a kaleidoscope. Every time the conversation turned, the same colored pieces arranged themselves in a new pattern. This is what group conversations feel like. They are messy and beautiful, and full of connections. Let me ask you the final set of questions. How long has it been since they last had dinner together? 3 months since Claire's birthday party. How long is Claire's commute? About 50 minutes each way. What did Brian used to do during his long commute? He listened to history podcasts. What is the name of the podcast Brian recommended? Echoes of Time. Why did Claire make mushroom risotto? Because Michelle does not eat meat, and she wanted to make something special. What did Claire cook for Brian and Michelle's anniversary? A 3-course meal. What cooking class did Claire and Michelle take together? An Italian cooking class, where they learned to make fresh pasta. What did Brian say the podcast has an episode about? The history of Italian food. How many days a week can Claire work from home starting next month? 1 day a week. What connection did Claire make at the dinner table that excited her? She realized the history podcast, the Italian food episode, and the Italian cooking class all connected together. You followed a 3-person group conversation with multiple recycling threads, and you understood every connection. That is genuinely impressive. So here we are at the very end of this entire lesson, and I want to leave you with something meaningful. Everything we practice today comes down to one simple idea. Real conversations are not straight lines. They are circles and spirals and webs, and when you learn to follow those circles and spirals and webs, you unlock a level of English that most learners never reach. You stop being someone who just catches words and starts being someone who understands people. You stop being a passive listener and start being an active participant in the flow of conversation. And that changes everything. It changes how you feel when you talk to native speakers. It changes how you feel when you watch movies without subtitles. It changes how you feel about yourself and your English abilities. Because the truth is, you are already better than you think. If you made it through this entire lesson and followed all these conversations and answered all those questions in your head, then you have a level of listening comprehension that you should be proud of. Do not let anyone tell you that your English is not good enough. Do not let your own doubts tell you that you are not ready. You are ready. You have been ready. You just needed someone to show you how real conversations work, and that is what we did here today. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending all this time with English in Fluency. The fact that you stayed through this entire lesson tells me something about you. It tells me you are serious about improving your English. It tells me you are willing to put in the work. And it tells me you are the kind of person who does not give up when things get challenging. Those qualities will take you far, not just in English, but in everything you do. So please keep going. Keep practicing. Keep listening. Keep showing up here every week. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already, because there is so much more coming. Leave a comment and tell me how you feel after this extended practice. Did it change the way you think about listening? Did it make you more confident? Did you have a favorite conversation? I want to know. And share this lesson with someone who needs it. You never know who is out there struggling with the exact same thing and just needs someone to explain it the way we did here. You could be the person who helps them take that next step. This has been an incredible journey together, and I am genuinely grateful for every minute you spent with me. You are the reason English in Fluency exists, and you are the reason I will keep making these lessons. So from me to you, thank you. Keep listening. Keep growing. Keep believing in yourself. And I will see you right here in the next lesson. Take care, and bye for now.